welcome to part 4 of our recent World Holiday Spectacular trip aboard the Regent 7 Seas Voyager. In this part, we're going to spend a lazy day at sea on the 1st of January, followed by a visit to Abidjan on the Côte d'Ivory, or the Ivory Coast, then on to Sekondi in Ghana, then Lome in the country of Togo, before finishing up with one more day at sea en route to Tomé in the island nation of Príncipe. Well, let's get started with New Year's Day. As one would expect, it was a very quiet day aboard the ship, as most nursed hangovers throughout the day. Of course, when I say most, I mean mostly me. And so after a low-key day and a low-key dinner, it was time for a little entertainment in the Constellation Theater, and tonight was saxophonist and instrumentalist Ollie Nez. Unfortunately, Mr. Nez's concert was not as well attended as normal because of, I assume, the aftermath of the previous night's indulgences. Regardless, he put on a wonderful performance. We arrived the next day in Abidjan in the country of the Ivory Coast at around 11 in the morning. Abidjan's population is around 6.3 million, which is 21.5% of the overall population of the Ivory Coast, and makes it the 6th most populous city in all of Africa. There's apparently not a whole lot to do in the area, and only a total of 3 excursions were offered. We chose one that we thought would involve a bit of hiking and a bit of discovery in the jungle. How did it turn out? Check the end of this excursion to find out. Abidjan itself is a sort of dichotomy of styles, with modern skyscrapers juxtaposed against the backdrop of extreme poverty. From point A to point B, our 6 large tour buses were escorted by several policemen on motorcycles who cleared the way for us. It made us feel very much like VIPs. Arriving at the Banco Forest, we were turned over to a local guide by our local guide, who spoke only French. Our local guide would then translate from French to English for us, and we in turn would have to sort of translate in our heads from his version of English into something we could all understand. Now, just so you know, that is not criticism, as my language skills in any language other than English are truly abysmal, and in the end, our guides did a fine job of getting their point across. First stop was this tiny museum and information center. It was here that we found out that the size of the park is around 3,438 hectares, or around 8,495 acres, roughly 20 square kilometers. In the tiny museum, there were informational posters telling us somewhat more about the park and the wildlife inhabitants of this park. At one time, there were thought to be over 10,000 chimpanzees living in the park, but now only as many as 200 can be found. I thought it unlikely that we would see any of the wildlife unless we were headed for an area that they occupied. After our visit to the museum, we proceeded on, and our park ranger guide would stop and tell us about the various flora and fauna in the park. This is a signal tree. If you strike the roots in just the right way, a sound is produced that can be heard from quite a distance. Here's me doing my best to make that signal, but failing spectacularly. The park is a popular spot with the locals as well, and many were here partying and enjoying the park facilities. Speaking of facilities offered by the park, they were interesting and of a very basic nature. In fact, they were simply holes in the ground with a phone booth-like structure sitting over that hole. After each use, a local would flush the toilet by throwing a bucket of water in the toilet and on the floor. Even though the Banco Forest is a national park, there are several families living in a tiny village within the park. The ancestors of those families had been living in the park for generations before it was made a national park. We passed through the village as we began our walk. This was supposed to be a 3-kilometer walk, and perhaps it was, but it sure measured a shorter distance by my reckoning. Unfortunately, lots of flora was noted, but no fauna presented itself, including absolutely none of the supposedly 200 chimpanzees living in the park. And after a short distance, certainly much less than a kilometer, we inexplicably just simply turned around and headed back through the village and to a small bridge spanning a small creek that runs by the village. We did see our first animals. These were gigantic catfish that were fed every time a tourist walked by to make sure that they were always in attendance. Then it was time to return to the buses, where we waited for about 30 minutes for someone who had gone missing. Eventually to be reunited, and we started once more on our way. Lights and sirens and police escort leading the way. We once more passed through the very interesting streets of Abidjan, and though I hate taking pictures from a bus window, the street scenes were interesting enough that I certainly gave it a try. Until we ran across, well, this friendly bunch. Stopped once more at the obligatory African arts and crafts shopping area, which turned out to be very interesting. Although we ourselves are not much in the way of shoppers, much of the art and wood carvings were pretty cool. And as the sign says, thanks for visiting, and we were once more on our way, shadowed by not only our police escort, but an ambulance and paramedic. Well, what did we think of this adventure? It was pleasant enough, if not a little restrictive, and felt a bit incomplete. We definitely felt a bit shortchanged in our walk through the jungle. But soon enough, we were back on board the Regent 7 Seas Voyager, and said goodbye to our police escort and ambulance folks, changed and headed up to dinner. Tonight, instead of Sette Mare being an Italian restaurant, it was an African buffet. I did not know what to expect, but found it very delicious, for the most part visually appealing, and overall just very good. Generally, when Sette Mare is open, only half of the restaurant is used from its normal La Veranda configuration. In this case, the African buffet was such a hit, the entire restaurant was open and crowded. From salad bar to buffet line to the modest dessert table, everything was absolutely delicious. And after several trips to the buffet line, you have to sample everything, you know. It was time to call it quits and later head to the observation lounge with new friends for a bit of conversation and a nightcap and head for bed because tomorrow would be another port day. And the next day we made port in Sekondi in the country of Ghana. And today's excursion would be the twin cities of Sekondi and Takoradi. And as in yesterday, we were accompanied by a police escort to quote-unquote control traffic. I found this particularly interesting since the police in this case were blatantly armed with what appeared to be automatic weapons, AK-47s, and while this made me somewhat suspicious about the true purpose of our escort, it also greatly reinforced the idea that our escort could indeed, quote-unquote, control traffic. Today, our excursion would take us mostly into the twin city of Takoradi for a visit to the local fisherman's port and a later stop at a hotel for an African cultural dance demonstration. Was about 30 minutes away at the local fishing port, where we received a demonstration lecture about how the government subsidized ice plant manufactured ice for the fishermen to ensure that their catch was returned to the port with the best, most fresh, and consistent results. Justifiably proud of their facility. It was clean and well run, and able to pump out hundreds of these blocks of ice in a single day. After the demonstration, we wandered around a bit, looking over the large fishing fleet that was docked because today was a Saturday. I really loved the appearance and texture of these weather and sea-worn boats jam-packed into the docking areas. We noticed that many of the ships flew foreign flags such as UK and even US flags. We quizzed our tour guide, Sam, if there was any special meaning or the boats were indeed flagged in different countries. His response was that the captain of each vessel simply chose a flag to fly with no concern for the fact that it was actually a Ghanaian vessel, but with the knowledge that the Ghanaian government could actually care less. Back on the road again with our police escort, we glided past old wheelhouses from salvaged ships being used as what looked to be storerooms. Passing locals with large loads on their head headed toward the fish market, railroad tracks leading nowhere, and pop-up marketplaces everywhere. Before heading downtown to get a glimpse of what they call the Circle Market. The Circle Market is so called because you can actually drive all the way around it. Now they're building a new modern building to house the marketplace, but according to our guide, they had been building, quote unquote, the new pavilion for 5 years, and the project has been more or less abandoned for the last 3 of those 5 years. And despite promises, no real completion date is known at this time, and the displaced vendors still line the streets around the abandoned marketplace. Next stop was a African dance and music review at a local 5-star hotel. It was extremely well done and immersive, so I'm going to shut up now and let you enjoy the rhythms and the dance. was the end of our tour. Was it a good one? Well, for the most part, it was somewhat forgettable, but the African dance and music review at the end of the trip made it worth the effort. Well, back at the Voyager once more, we took time to look over the marketplace that had been set up and found that the goods displayed reflected what we had seen in the more permanent marketplaces at our previous stops. And, in fact, I would say that much of it might have been sourced from the same vendors and artists. Regardless, stepping back on board, we decided to forego lunch and just see what was available at the Coffee Connection. And today, while enjoying a matcha latte, we discovered what was to become our favorite dessert, reminiscent of Viking's success cake, the apricot success. And then later, as the sun sunk low, we did our sail away from Ghana. What you see in the distance is a monstrous power ship. This power ship is so big that it generates well over 30% of Ghana's total electrical needs. Changing for dinner, and we headed for our second turn at Prime 7. This time we had to share a table with two other couples, which made it a little crowded, but still doable, and allowed me to see something I don't get a chance to see very often because I'm not allowed, the bread basket. But told not to touch the bread. She started with a tuna and avocado poke, while I went with a beautiful seared diver scallop, setting atop a chunk of pork belly before diving into this perfectly cooked 18-ounce ribeye steak. And this evening, she tried the Applewood smoked salmon in a tamarind whiskey sauce. For more on Prime 7 and all of the other dining venues aboard the Regent 7 Seas Voyager, check out our already published dining and drink guide. And now it's time to run, hide, and plug your ears. It's karaoke night once more. After abusing people's sensibilities and eardrums for a while, it was time for bed and another port day in Togo the next morning. The next morning found us in the port of Lome in the country of Togo. After a beautiful and smooth sail in to Lome, arriving right at our expected time of 9 o'clock in the morning. On arrival, we were greeted by a lineup of buses ready to take us on our various excursions. There were limited excursions available for the day, in fact, only 3, and we had opted to witness a voodoo ceremony in the nearby village of Sanguera. As we made our way to the bus, there was an African dance and drum troupe performing for passengers as we left the ship. And as before, we were accompanied by a police escort for that traffic control thing. On the bus, we had 2 local guides who told us about the practice of voodoo. According to our guides, voodoo is a religion practiced around Africa in different ways. Done benevolently, it is said to have healing properties, can be used to find lost things, or can even be utilized for vengeful, spiteful retribution and revenge. And yes, that sometimes involves the practice of sticking pins in voodoo dolls made for just those purposes. And after about a 45-minute drive, we arrived in Sanguera after negotiating some very interesting roads our large motor coaches had a bit of difficulty traversing. Once there, it was off the bus to receive a greeting from the local chief and to be told that this was a real voodoo worship ceremony and that the village does this as its regular routine, and only sometimes does it open its doors to outsiders to witness the rituals. It is impossible to show the entire ceremony because we were there for only less than 1 hour, and we were told that the ceremony had started early in the morning and would continue all the way till midnight. And despite what your personal feelings are on the practice of voodoo, it can be said that these people certainly believe in it and put a massive amount of energy into the rituals. And while I don't pretend to actually know what's going on, here is a few samples of what we witnessed. One of the things that our guides told us to watch for was a demonstration of invulnerability. Supposedly, when voodoo goes right, the practitioners can be made safe from knife wounds or even gunshot wounds. And while there is no way to know just how sharp this knife was that this fella was wielding, it was also certain that I was not going to go out and challenge him about it. And as we made our way out of the ceremony, we caught a glimpse of what happens to those overcome during the ceremony and of the certified fastest chickens in the village that were able to evade capture and not be part of the ceremonies. And as we sat in the bus, we witnessed this young man, probably the hardest working young man in the village, who was filling this pan of water, delivering it, and then returning for a payout handed to him by a young man about the same age after being tormented by that same young man, and then returning to do it all over again. Eventually, all the buses were loaded, and one that was stuck was unstuck, and we gathered our police escort armed with AK-47s and started back towards the ship. And on the way back, we were treated to several examples of Togolese mass transit. This one is my absolute favorite. eventually traffic gave way to thousands of people gathering at the beaches for a little R&R. And lining the beaches, along with those thousands of people, were these many little pop-up food stalls and bars and a smattering of more permanent-looking structures. And then it was back on the Voyager, where I spent a good part of the afternoon working on these videos. Then it was time to change for dinner and enjoy the sail away from the observation lounge. Dinner tonight would once more be at the Compass Rose, where we enjoyed some lighter selections this evening. But at least I gave in and opted for this, a mountain of unctuous pork belly cooked adobo style. After some entertainment, it was time for bed and get ready for our next lazy day at sea. Well, the next morning I got up feeling all Viking-like, and we went downstairs to participate in, well, an axe throwing competition. While many axes were thrown, only one struck true. And then that evening, it was change into our finest and head off to the Seven Seas Society meeting. For more long lines, another greet the captain and senior officers, and then watch the awards being given for most nights on board. Enjoy a few cocktails.
Travel with people that I've traveled with many times before.
A few speeches from our cruise director, Natalie. A few words from our captain.
Bonsoir. Ah, c'est tellement plus facile quand c'est en français.
And a toast from host Hipa.
To many more champagne toasts, fabulous adventures, and plenty more Regent cruises. Cheers to you, our very loyal Regent guests. Cheers.
After the reception, it was off to dinner at Compass Rose. Check out our dining and drinking guide already published for more on the Compass Rose and the other dining venues aboard the Regent Seven Seas Voyager. And after a full evening, we retired to the Horizon Lounge for drinks and conversation, catching the tail end of a performance by the Regent Signature Orchestra. We've come to the end of part 4 of our World Holiday Spectacular Cruise. Thank you for watching, and please like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell to be kept up to date with new videos as they arrive. If you have the interest, check out my much neglected website, tomsmultiinterest.com, and stay tuned for more. Part 5 is on the way, and we will be visiting the port of Sao Tomé in the island nation of Príncipe, followed by 3 days at sea en route to Walvis Bay in Namibia. Safe and happy travels from T's Cruise and Travel Muse.